Hey, what's up? EZOVERDOSE here. This is my Elemental Shaman guide. It's going to teach you how to play Elemental Shaman with the best of them. Let's start with talents. There's only two tiers that are going to affect your DPS, and that's 60 and 90. And generally speaking, you're going to get Echo of Elements and Elemental Blast. They provide the biggest DPS gain on long fights. If you're doing something like Brawler's Guild, you possibly get Primal Elementalist and Elemental Mastery. For Glyphs, there's only one that really affects DPS, and that's just AoE DPS. And that's the Chain Lightning Glyph. And then the other two are Survivability. Flame Shot gives you a little bit of a heal. Lightning Shield gives you damage mitigation. For stats, obviously start with 15% hit chance. You want to make sure you get 15%, that's your spell cap for any caster. And then for red sockets, you're going to go with Hybrid, 80 Intellect, 160 Mastery, Artful, Vermilion Onyx. For blue, you're going to go with the Zen Wild Jade, it's a green gem. Then anywhere you have a yellow gem or a socket where the socket bonus is not worth getting, then you are going to go Pure Mastery. For your single target rotation, this is going to be no cooldowns. This is just going to be the standard casting rotation. You're going to do Flame Shock, Lava Burst, Elemental Blast, Fulmination at 5 to 7 charges, make sure Searing Totem is down, and Lightning Bolt Filler. So, Flame Shock, Lava Burst, Elemental Blast, make sure Searing Totem is down, Fulmination, and then Lava Burst. Now I dropped Searing Totem before I actually casted Fulmination. That's because the Earth Shock is still on cooldown from using Flame Shock, so I left it just a bad situation. But the priority of the rotation is still Fulmination in front of Searing Totem. Basically only drop Searing Totem if everything else has been cast and the only thing left to cast is Lightning Bolt. So the single target rotation gets complicated a bit by needing to refresh Flame Shock and needing to dump your Lightning Shield charges within the same 5-second time frame where Flame Shock is ticking off the target. And the way you decide on what's priority for your situation is if you can get a Lava Burst off, another Lava Burst off, then you should probably go ahead and refresh Flame Shock. If the boss is still like full health, you definitely refresh Flame Shock. Even if you have 7 charges, keeping Flame Shock on the target is still priority, because in the time that the shock cooldown resets, Flame Shock ticks can proc a free Lava Burst cast 2 or 3 times. I'm not sure the exact number on how fast Flame Shock ticks. It doesn't actually say how fast it ticks by default, and that's based on your haste. So it can tick 2 to 3 times in the 5-second window that it's going to take for Flame Shock to come back off cooldown. So that's potentially 2 to 3 Lava Burst casts that you lose, which can crit. You know, they can crit big, but on average they crit probably around 200k. So it's 200, 400, 600k damage that you could potentially lose. And if you get a Fulmination crit, it's possible it could crit that big, but that's a low chance. So Flame Shock is the priority unless the mob is dying. And then an exception with the mob is dying is you don't want to dump your Fulmination charges on the last mob of a trash pull right before a boss, and I'll cover that in a minute. It's about using the 2-piece tier bonus effectively with your opening burst. But first I want to talk about how Flame Shock snapshots your stats. And what that means is whatever stats that you have when you put Flame Shock on the target, is how hard and fast Flame Shock is going to tick. So if I put Flame Shock on all of these targets, I'm going to start with the right and then go left. You can see here my trinket is ticking and climbing up. So this last target here is not going to have any trinket procs or anything, so if you just watch how fast it's ticking, how hard it's ticking, and compare this last one over here, 8700 to, say this Raider one, 15371, you can see this one's ticking for almost double. So that's called snapshot. Snapshots your stats. And you can use that to your advantage if you have something set up to track your trinket procs, like I do, which I'll cover this add-on and a little bit about it at the end of the video. So, but you can use that to your advantage by knowing if your Flame Shock is going to run off and then refresh it a little bit early just to get a hasted tick. Now for two targets, and let's say the targets are stacked up, you would maintain a single target rotation, but you would swap out a lightning bolt for chain lightning. So chain lightning is your new filler instead of lightning bolt. Everything else stays the same as far as priority. And of course, if they're spread out, you would keep Flame Shock on both of them, if at all possible, and just maintain single target rotation. Now for three targets, assuming that three targets are grouped up in a pile, like these training dummies, you are just going to cast Chain Lightning. Now there's a threshold where this is more beneficial to multi-dotting the three targets, but if they're just stacked up in a pile, Chain Lightning is going to give you more DPS than trying to maintain dots on all three. And then that goes as well as 3, 4, 5, however many there is. And in Siege of Orgrimmar, I really haven't seen a fight where Earthquake is more beneficial than just casting Chain Lightning, because Earthquake is not affected by Mastery, so you don't get any extra cast off Earthquake. Chain Lightning can proc off the Mastery, so then you get a free cast. And that's kind of the same deal with Magma Totem. You have to think Magma Totem, you have to walk into the mobs, which can take 3 to 5 seconds just to walk into the grouped up mobs, drop Magma Totem, and then start casting. By that time, you're already 1 million to 3 to 5 million damage behind all of the other people that just are casting. Then you're playing catch up. So unless there's like a crap load of mobs, and the mobs are not going to move, it's not worth dropping Magma Totem, because most likely the mobs are going to get moved. Most likely the mobs are going to die fast enough where Chain Lightning's gonna, or Magma Totem's not going to be beneficial. So I'd say just stick with Searing Totem for simplicity. Mathematically, Magma Totem is better at like 2.5 targets, so if you have 3 targets or more, Magma Totem's better. But once again, they have to be stationary for the entire time to be more beneficial. Now for multi-dotting, we're going to use the Fallen Protectors fight as an example, because on this fight there's 3 bosses and usually they're spread out far enough to where you can't Chain Lightning. So on this type of fight, you would try to maintain your Flame Shock on all 3 targets, and that is so you're constantly getting your Lava Surge procs, or the free Lava Burst resetting, and the priority is still going to be the same as a single target rotation. Flame Shock's going to be the priority, even if you have 7 charges built up on your Lightning Shield. If you need to put Flame Shock on a target, make sure you keep it up. And it's important to to actually maximize your DPS like this is your positioning. You need to position yourself where you have all three bosses in your field of view, so you're not like being clumsy with the camera and having to turn and target something way out of range. That's another thing. If it's out of range and you can't actually click its life bar, which you should always play with life bars on just for this reason, then that could possibly be a DPS loss too, trying to worry about getting in range to click the target and turning your camera to actually face the target to get flame shock on it. So if you can't do it all seamlessly, and you can only do it seamlessly on 2, just worry about 2, and then kind of maybe when you're casting lightning bolt, kind of maybe reposition yourself to where you go from facing these 2 targets, casting lightning bolt, to facing the target that's out of range, out of your field of view, and then get the dot on it, and then reposition yourself back towards facing the original 2 to continue on. But basically, if you can't, as a DPS, you always want to be using every global cooldown. If you're not using a global cooldown, you are most likely not making DPS. So it's key to utilize every global cooldown and have no downtime. So once again, if that means not being able to get flame shock on all 3 targets, then so be it. Something to go along with the lava surge procs is obviously like your latency is a factor and your reaction time is a factor, and you need to go into interface, into combat, and find this thing called custom lag tolerance. And what this is, it's called spell queuing. It used to be named spell queuing, and it's basically it queues up whatever button you hit after you hit it. So if say you cast something and then you hit another key, it's gonna queue that spell up next to cast, even though you hit the key 2 seconds ago. Like this thing controls how long that threshold is on when you hit the key to still cast it. So if you're a button masher and you like to mash your buttons like really fast, you set this lower. You set this to your basically your ping, if you have low ping, or lower than your ping. So you need to kind of see what your latency is. So I'm at 25 right now, and I generally sit around 25 to 30. So I have this set to 30, and that way if I'm mashing a key and Lava Surge procs and Lava Burst comes off cooldown, even though I'm mashing a key in mid-global cooldown, casting something else, I can still switch back and hit Lava Burst and use that proc and not cast whatever I was mashing. So that can play a pretty big factor in, you know, it might account for like 5-10% DPS, I don't really know the math, but it can be a pretty big factor in utilizing all of your procs, because that can proc in the time that it actually you cast something else. So I mean, it can proc, you cast something else on accident, it can re-proc in that time. So if you were to cast it instead of accidentally casting something else, it could then proc again as you cast it. So then you'd have like 2 lava bursts back to back versus 1 lightning bolt, which that's, you know, a pretty big damage difference that you want to take advantage of. Alright, for cooldowns, we'll do a couple different variations of this. One's going to be with the tier bonus. It's a flat 4% damage modifier for each stack of fulmination you hit the target with. So you want to go into a boss fight with your lightning shield charges primed up to 7. That way you have 14 seconds of this debuff of 4% damage modifier for extra damage. So the previous trash pull before the boss, you need to make sure that you're not dumping your lightning shield charges at the end of the pull just to try to get a little bit of extra DPS on trash, because trash don't matter. So we're going to do a variation of this with heroism and without heroism. I'll tell you when you should weave heroism into your cooldown rotation. So for the tier bonus cooldown rotation, you would do Stormlash totem first, and the reason you do Stormlash first is because it's more of a raid cooldown than a personal cooldown. It doesn't really do a whole lot of personal DPS, it's more for overall DPS for the entire raid. Just a small bit from everybody adds up. So you do that first, and the reason you do it first is because you don't want to use a global cooldown in the middle of your opening burst rotation, because that's when you have all of your uptime on your trinkets and stuff, and that's when you're doing like big numbers. So if you waste uptime on your trinkets casting a global cooldown that doesn't really affect your personal DPS that much, you're not going to do as much DPS. So Flame Shock, Fire Elemental Totem, and the reason you do Flame Shock first and Fire Elemental Totem second is because Fire Elemental Totem does like a frequency check to see if you've hit anything and you have Flame Shock on something, because if you cast it without hitting something, it can stand there, and I've seen it stand there for like many seconds, just like in dumb mode. It just stands there and does nothing, and it's a big chunk of DPS. It can do like 10% of your DPS in some fights if you can get it casted like twice. So, and especially with the trinket procs too, because it's it dynamically scales with your trinket procs, unlike Flame Shock. It used to work like Flame Shock did and snapshot of your stats, but now it works like in a dynamic fashion, to where as your trinkets proc and you get procs and stuff, it hits harder in real time. So Flame Shock, and then Fire Elemental Totem, and then this is assuming that it's a fight where you need to cast Heroism on the pool. Let's just say like Iron Juggernaut. You would then cast Heroism before you go into your first cast, so it's like global cooldown, global cooldown, global cooldown, and then before you actually need to cast something, which would be your fourth global cooldown, then you would cast Heroism, because Heroism's off the global cooldown. So it would be Stormlash, Flame Shock, Fire Elemental, Heroism, and then Lava Burst, Elemental Blast, and then you're probably going to have to cast one Lightning Bolt, waiting on Earth Shock to dump your Fulmination charges. So then it would be one Lightning Bolt, and Fulmination. Then you would have Ascendance and Spirit Walker's Grace macroed together, and then you would cast that, and then spam Lava Burst. And then if it's a fight where you don't cast Heroism, obviously you just pull Heroism out of that rotation. And if you do not have the tier piece that I'm talking about, the set bonus, you would just cast Ascendance / Spirit Walker's Grace after you casted Elemental Blast. Alright, so I stacked my Lightning Shield charges to 7 just to demonstrate this, and I waited a couple minutes for my trinkets to come off cooldown. So So there it is. There's almost 450k burst, 550 item level. Now a little tip to go along with this is, because Ascendance is not on the global cooldown, you can actually cast it when you're in mid-global cooldown, which you do not want to do. So if you were to rewind and watch carefully, I actually wait till like the last second to cast Ascendance, because if I would have casted Ascendance as soon as I dumped my Fulmination charges, I mathematically waste a global cooldown of potential Ascendance burst, which is basically one Lava Burst. So I'll talk about macros for a second, some of the macros I use. These aren't really going to be in any order, I'm just going to kind of go through them the way that they're in my box here. For Chain Lightning, if you've seen any of my other videos, you know I'm a big fan of the start attack macros, and I'll go over that briefly, the way that works real quick. If if you've never seen any of my other videos. So start attack basically hits tab for you one time and puts you in auto attack stance. So if I was to just cast Chain Lightning, it does nothing because I don't have a target. Now if I type out / start attack and hit enter, you can see it grabs that target and puts me in like melee mode. Now, usually the way this works is / start attack will pick up the target that is closest to you / the most center of your view. So if I was to move over here, and now that this training dummy is the closest to me, and hit start attack again, it'll pick that one up. And if I go over here and hit start attack, it'll pick that one up. But if you were like closer to this one and you're aiming at that one, it might not pick up what you want it to pick up. It's going to pick up whatever's closest to you. So that's kind of how start attack works. So you basically, anything that's considered an opener, anything that you would cast without a target, but you need a target, so that would be like Lightning Bolt, Chain Lightning, Flame Shock, Earth Shock, Elemental Blast, any of those, you would probably want to macro start attack to it. That way you don't have to acquire a target. As long as you're pointing at the target, you're going to pick up a target. It'll be all good. So I have / use 10 in my macro, and what that is I'm an engineer, and that tells that key press to activate my Tinker, the plus 1920 intellect. And that basically just keeps, I have that macroed into more than one thing, so that basically keeps that on cooldown, because it's such a short cooldown, you want to use it as much as possible so you have the most uptime out of it. And then of course the show tooltip is just to show the Chain Lightning tooltip. So if you weren't an engineer, or I'll kind of show you how this works, just a little macro tip. If I didn't have the show tooltip in there and saved it, it would show the icon for my hands, which I don't want. If I wasn't an engineer, I'd take that line out, and then it would have the icon for the Chain Lightning. So if you're not an engineer, this is probably what your macro is going to look like, just 2 lines / start attack / cast Chain Lightning. And this is a defensive macro. It casts Stone Bulwark Totem, Gift of Naru, and Shamanistic Rage. This is kind of like your oh shit button. You hit that, and basically mitigate lots of damage and do your little self-heal. Now, I'm Drain Eye, obviously, so if you weren't Drain Eye, you'd take that line out. And then this is the cooldown macro, appropriately named, as you can see, DFG, DFG. So it's / cast Ascendance and / cast Spirit Walker's Grace. Spirit Walker's Grace is a 2-minute cooldown, Ascendance is a 3-minute cooldown, so anytime Ascendance is off cooldown, Spirit Walker's Grace is off cooldown as well. Then Elemental Blast, simply just / start attack. Same for Earth Shock. I got one for Frost Shock, even though I don't think I have Frost Shock keybound. And then Flame Shock, I have / use 10 on my Flame Shock, because actually, even though these cast all simultaneously within like the same millisecond, because I have / use 10 before I have / cast Flame Shock, it gives me, when we're talking about the way Flame Shock snapshots your stats, I actually get the plus 1900 intellect by macroing it like this. And then / cast Hex / focus. This is just a good macro to have for general purposes. It's not really important for raiding. It doesn't affect your DPS obviously, and you rarely need it, but it's just a good general tip that when you CC something, that you should have it focused. That way you can keep an eye on your CC, so you can track the debuff a little bit better. And you can also use this to your advantage if you need to focus something on the fly. You can hit this key on the fly. So if I needed to focus, if this was my party member right here, and I clicked on them on my player frame like it's a tank or something, and I needed to do this on the fly, I could just hit focus on them and get back on my target. Same way with any target, you can actually use this while you're casting. So if you're in the middle of a cast and you're in the middle of a GCD, you can actually cast your you can actually hit your macro to focus them in the middle of a cast or in the middle of a GCD, and change your focus on the fly without, you know, any downtime of GCD usage. And then lightning bolt, start attack with engineer tinker, lava burst, no start attack because you need flame shock on your target to cast lava burst, or you should anyway, and flame shock has the start attack on it. And then I have magma totem and searing totem in a cast sequence macro. The way this works is we'll if you watch down here at the bottom where my spells are, I'll cast searing totem, and then you notice the icon changes to healing stream totem. So right now it's counting down from 20, and for 20 seconds I can cast healing stream totem on that same key, which for my uses, if you need to do this in like a heroic raid scenario or just progression raiding or something, you would obviously want to keybind these two spells separately, because you never know which one you're going to need and when you're going to need it. But for casual purposes, this macro works great. It works fine for me. So that's slash cast sequence, one word, space, reset equals 20, and this is the amount of seconds. So if you wanted it to be longer, you would change this number. So you could change that to like 55 or something, so that way you drop searing totem lasts 60 seconds, and that way basically the entire time searing totem's down, it's then waiting for you to cast healing stream totem until you need to recast searing totem again. And then you put the first spell in, which I have magma here for this example, comma, and then there's a space after this comma, and then the next spell, which is healing stream totem. That's for healing. Wind shear macro. This is useful. I don't really know how often you actually need to interrupt something this X-Pack. Like, I rarely use this, mainly for like some interrupting heals on like Galarakis or whatever his name is, and yeah, I can't really think of a whole lot of uses for it, but there's a couple, and they basically, anytime you're casting and you hit this macro, it'll stop your cast and it'll cast wind shear. So I'm out of range, kind of just testing this right now. But if I get in range and do it, see it stops your cast and cast wind shear right away. So I'll briefly talk about this add-on that I'm using to track all my cooldowns and stuff, my trinkets. It's called Tell Me When, and by the time you're watching this video, I might have already made a short, like, simple guide for using this add-on. And it's basically just watches spell cooldowns, it watches debuffs, it watches buffs, it watches basically anything. So we're just going to click on this Elemental Blast as an example. And here's kind of the stuff it can track. Spell cooldown, item cooldown, unit cooldown, internal cooldown, multi-state ability, reactive ability, blah blah blah. I mean, it's just a big old list of stuff. It can track like anything. So for Elemental Blast, I have it set to spell cooldown. And this tab is where you type the spell, whatever spell you want to track. And then usually you select the first one that pops up. So it has two of these, but it's actually, I think, for the second one is the actual buff that you get for it. So it's usually the top one that you pick. If you have this set right, the top one in here is usually right, with a few exceptions. And then this comes unchecked by default, and I set this to 50%, and this is the opacity of the icon. So it's going to be 50% transparent, and this is directly related to this down here that I have checked, the duration requirements. You can see it kind of overlaps poorly, but it's probably because of my font add-on. So I have this set to 1.5, which is a global cooldown that's not affected by haste. So my realistic global cooldown is probably like 1.4, maybe 1.3. So this gives me one global cooldown ahead of time notice that I need to change my rotation. And of course, if depending on your reaction time, you would set this higher. I don't know if I'd recommend setting it any lower than one global cooldown, but you could set it higher. You could set it for like 3. So 2 global cooldowns ahead of time, you would know that this is coming off cooldown and to hit it. And the timer is going to let it kind of fade in with the with all of these settings factored, with the opacity settings factored. Let it kind of fade in, you know, as it's like coming off cooldown. And then the allow global cooldown lets you see the global cooldown on the icon. So I basically have Lava Burst is set like that, Earth Shock set like that. I have Flame Shock set to track as a debuff on the target. So top tab here, set to buff debuff. Then you actually change this from buff to debuff. Put your spell in there, and then for your units to watch, you would need to watch the target. And then you would need to check this, only check mine, otherwise it's going to see other people's Flame Shock on there and not know any different. And as long as there's a Flame Shock on the target, period, you would, the icon would work, you know, or it would think it's working properly, but it's really not going to work properly. So, like Curse of Elements or something, that's when you would uncheck this. And then I have this all set to like show full, show the timer, and then I have it set to 7 seconds, so the shock cooldown is actually 5 seconds, so this gives me a 2-second window to see the icon pop up and decide, do I want to dump my fulmination charges or do I want to refresh my flame shock. So it gives me a 2-second window to make that decision, basically without losing any downtime of earth shock or flame shock on the boss. And then for fulmination, it's just a simple buff debuff track on lightning shield, with an exception that's down here on the text display. This by default is set to stacks hide, and you set it to stacks so it shows the stacks. And then this tab right here, I have it set to minimum 5, so it only shows at least 5, so it doesn't pop up until I have 5. And then these are trinkets, and they're set to buff and debuff. Now for Ascendance, I have it tracking 2 different things for Ascendance. One is the spell cooldown, and one is the buff debuff, because when you cast Ascendance, it doesn't actually go on cooldown till the effect is run off. So I'll click it, and so I just clicked it, but it's not on cooldown yet because the spell effect is still on me. So I have it tracking this as well as this, and that's so I can see 10 seconds ahead that it's coming off cooldown, and then I can see how much time I have left on the actual buff, so I can determine which spell I need to line up next. Like I'm spamming Lava Burst, spamming Lava Burst, spamming Lava Burst, and then I see that it's only got like 1 second left on the cast, and I can then know that I need to basically cast Elemental Blast next in line or whatever, Flame Refresh, Flame Shock or something. So that's going to wrap up my guide. Hope you found it useful and make some big deeps with your Elemental Shaman after watching this. Make sure you like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video and found anything useful, and see you next time.